Hello, class, and welcome back to another lesson. So, today's lesson, I want to cover a very important topic that I kind of just want you all to be aware of if you weren't already, which are some bad presentation habits you should avoid. And keyword is should. Again, these rules don't apply for every speaking situation, but we'll dive into that a little bit more in depth in this particular lesson. Okay, so again, topic for today, bad presentation habits you should avoid. So without further ado, let's take a look at number one. Now, number one, a habit you should avoid is sounding pessimistic, apathetic, like you just don't want to be there. Now, I think this particular rule can apply for every speaking situation because simply put, how many of you actually like listening to someone who sounds very pessimistic about their time or about a particular topic they're speaking about? Very few like that. Now, one example that I tend to have with a lot of my students is how many of my I ask my students how many of them actually enjoy hanging out with a friend who's just constantly negative, constantly talking about how difficult their life is, talking about how upset they are, talking about how this particular person in their life is disregarding them, things along those lines. Now, obviously, if they're your friend, you're more prone to listen to them because they've already established an emotional appeal with you. Because simply put, they're your friend. But this is the case when you obviously are listening to a speech or presentation from a stranger or someone you're just not really emotionally invested into. And I'm sure that you've all been in that situation where you are an audience member and you're just listening to someone kind of just complain and whine constantly and just giving off this vibe or this feeling like they just don't want to be there. Now, once you see that, how does that make you feel? You obviously are likely to reciprocate that particular feeling. If you don't want to be here, I don't want to be here either. So, can we just end it? Right? Isn't that a feeling that you tend to have? That's what most people will have. So, as a speaker, obviously, as difficult as it may be, even if you are hard, even if you are having a hard or difficult day, one thing you should always avoid is just walking into a room and standing up for your presentation looking and sounding defeated or that you kind of just are upset with something. Now, I've always been I've always been a stickler for that because one thing that I remember in particular is when I was a student. I remember I had this one professor who 80% of the time walked into the classroom, shoulders down, eyes looking towards the ground, walking in and just sounding and kind of mumbling, "Hey, like, how you guys all doing?" Stuff like that. And this particular professor would talk about their personal lives and how upsetting it was. I don't want to dive too much into detail, but it was just you can feel there was just like this dark cloud in the room and all the students just felt super awkward and uncomfortable. Now, this same example can be applied to your presentation. The moment that you choose to be pessimistic and apathetic and sounding like you just don't care, that same feeling is going to be sent to your audience. And again, this rule can be also applied to just simple conversations you have with your friends or colleagues. Now, obviously, it depends on your audience. If your audience is your best friend, they might be more understanding of of you being apathetic towards whatever you're talking about. Now, when you're in a professional setting, obviously that's one thing you should avoid. Now, one thing I always do, and one thing that always helps me out kind of to make sure that I'm on point when it comes to my presentations, no matter how difficult my day is or how difficult my life is, because I have that. But the reality is that none of my students and most of my friends or colleagues will never know. It's because I have a mental switch. It's yeah. I have a mental switch that I flip on when it comes to speaking in front of someone. And I can turn that on and off when it comes to speaking to my class or when I'm just talking to friends, right? Depending on the friend. And I would encourage you to have the same thing. Have this switch to kind of turn on your professionalism. Be on point. And that's a facade or this image that you need to kind of work on and develop and craft. And the great thing about improving your public speaking skills is that you'll be able to do that. Because when you're communicating, people see different sides of you. But that's a whole no that's a whole nother lesson. Okay, but I digress. I don't want to go off on a tangent too much. But avoid sounding pessimistic, apathetic, like you just don't want to be there. And I think that's pretty straightforward because again, I'm sure whoever's listening, you've been in that position before as well. You've sat there almost kind of forced to listen to someone complain, and it just makes you feel uncomfortable. Now because you know how that feels, don't do that to others, right? You don't have to be super energetic. You don't have to be super ecstatic. That's not what I'm asking you to do. At the very least, be professional. You can be a little bit more neutral with your feelings. You can just be professional, deliver said information, and then make sure that everyone's on point. Make sure everyone's aware of whatever information you're delivering. Make sure everyone is understanding of that content, and then move on. And then you can just relax later. But when it comes to public speaking situations, you always need to be on point. You need to be on point. Okay. Moving forward, tip number 2 is don't rely on audience participation. Now, this depends on the speaking situation. Now, one thing that I always suggest for my students and my clients is never rely on audience participation, because the moment you do, you're giving power of your presentation over to your audience. And that can be problematic depending on your audience. And I'm sure that you've all seen it before. Now, let's say you're in, like, I'll just use a personal example. So often in my classes, when students are delivering speeches, there's always a handful of students who start off their speech with the question that is wanting other students to raise their hands or say yes, object, or agree, whatever. And an example would be, who here likes McDonald's, right? Now let's take that question as an example. Now, what happens when you ask that question, who here likes McDonald's, and no one says or does anything? You ask that question, you stare into the audience, and everyone is just looking at you like, huh? Now, the reality is, if you are in that position, once you experience that, your confidence will be crushed. So, instead, just make a statement. Don't rely on audience participation. Instead of asking the question, who here likes McDonald's, you can say, 80% of people here likes McDonald's. Now, why is this important? What's the difference between the question and the statement? The question is, again, the moment you ask it is the moment you're handing power over your presentation to complete strangers, if that's who your audience is. Because one thing a lot of people rely on so heavily is audience raising their hands, having them be energetic, etc., etc., which I personally, I don't really understand. I'm not sure why a lot of people rely on audience participation, but they do. But the reality is that as an audience member, you just want to sit back and relax and do nothing, right? As an audience member, think about it. Let's say a typical day at work. You go in, you have a presentation at 12:30. You're not delivering it, but let's say your colleague is delivering a presentation at 12:30. So around lunchtime, right? Let's say you just had lunch. You go there, you sit down, and then your colleague who's giving a presentation asks a question, right? How many blah 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 blah. What do you feel like doing at that situation? Will you respond? Will you say something? Will you raise your hand? The reality is, what do you actually want to do? For most people, they don't want to do anything. They don't want to engage. They don't want to like a video. They don't want to comment on a video. They don't want to like or comment on your podcast, right? That's just the reality, and that's okay. Now, you need to use this information to your advantage. Therefore, don't put yourself in that position where you can have your confidence crushed because audience members don't want to participate. Now, the reality is that it's not that the audience doesn't agree with your question. Even if it's a simple rhetorical question, is like, who here has $1, right? I'm assuming everyone should say yes. Maybe, I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't want to. Yeah, I don't know if you have $1 or not, but I'm assuming if you say, who here has $1, most, if not all people will raise their hand. Even if the answer is yes, or even if, yeah, their answer is to raise their hand, that doesn't mean they'll do it. And that's one thing a lot of people don't understand when they're trying to deliver a speech or deliver a presentation, is that they want so heavily to engage with the audience, but they don't understand that the audience might not want to engage with them. Now, if you are putting your audience in a position where they should engage, again, a lot of things can go wrong because you don't have control anymore. You gave it over to the audience. Now, the audience is left up to them to either raise their hand or not. Now, if you're in that situation, again, let's say you have one hand raised all of a sudden. Oftentimes, I've seen people say, like, "Oh, thanks for the pity hand raise," or "Thanks a lot, thanks for responding," or something along those lines, which then gets very uncomfortable and sad, at least for me. I don't know about y'all and your perspective, but it's a simple way to maneuver around this situation, which is just make a statement. Just tell me that 80% of people at McDonald's, just tell me that everyone here has $1 in their pocket or in their bank account, whatever. It's a simple way to avoid it. Now, I'm not, again, I just want to be clear. I'm not saying audience participation is completely bad. It depends on your audience and it depends on the speaking situation. Now, obviously, if you have good rapport with your audience, if they're all your employees and you're super cool with them and they're super cool with you, then of course ask questions because they want to be engaged. That's because you've established credibility. Now, if you haven't, again, you have to be weary of putting yourself out there because the audience has changed. The demographics have changed. Your credibility has changed. They don't know who you are, so they are less likely to engage with you, right? So be mindful of that. Now, last but not least, third and final tip, what to avoid: information overload. Now, there's a reason if you watch my podcast and my lessons, when I'm doing these freestyle lessons where, I just answer a research question, you'll notice that I always stick with 3 tips. Now, why is this important? Well, number one, it's the rule of threes, right? It's easier to remember. It's something that we are familiar with, right? We're used to that, and that, right? And the reason why you use 3 tips that's always solid is because, again, we've been taught that that's something we are familiar with. But more importantly, it's just enough information or it's just enough key points where you can dive into depth about said information. Now, when it comes to your presentation or speech, you want to figure out whether your goal is breadth or depth. Breadth meaning how wide of a scope your topic you want to talk about, or depth. Now, and if you're not familiar with that, breadth would be, let's say, as an example, let's say for this video for bad presentation habits you should avoid, breadth would be if I covered 15 points, right? 15 tips. But for those 15 tips, I only briefly discuss it. I say a sentence or two each for each point. Now, depth is obviously what I'm doing now, which are 3 main points, and then I want to dive deep into it. Now, why do I like this particular style? It's because I want to make sure, or I want to do my best job to make sure you understand and grasp the material. And that's why I kind of offer a lot of examples, because as an audience, again, you need to put yourself in my shoes. I don't really know who I'm talking to, because this is either a podcast or a video depending on where you're watching. So I don't know how old you are. I don't know your likes, dislikes, your qualifications. I don't know what particular issues you have when it comes to speaking. So I'm kind of just shooting in the dark. So I need to take that information into account. I need to minimize the amount of information overload when it comes to key ideas, but I want to dive deeper into said ideas. And why do I provide extra examples? Because I'm not sure if each example resonates with you. So it's kind of like just shooting my shot multiple times. But when it comes to your presentation, one thing a lot of people do is they just shoot out bullet points of information. And I think the main reason people do that, especially younger adults, or one thing that I've noticed with a lot of my students, is they have the tendency to focus on breadth, focus on a wide scope of information. And that's because for some reason, again, this is my theory, they just are accustomed to reading articles online that have a lot of like multiple tips, because a lot of those entertainment articles have a tendency to, list 1 to 5 items that you should do, 1 to 5 tips to get healthier, 15 superfoods that you should eat on the daily, whatever it may be. But if you notice with those articles, most of them that that list like 100 things, they don't really focus on depth. Now, when you take a look at real scholarly research, real thorough research, you'll notice that the topic itself is super, super narrow. It's super, super specific. It's kind of like how McDonald's affects teenagers in low socioeconomic levels, from the ages of 11 to 15. I don't know. I just made that up. That's what a lot of researchers do, because they understand it takes a lot of damn time to be able to collect good, solid research on that particular age group and then that specific topic. Now, the same thing when it comes to your presentation. Again, it depends on what you're trying to do. If you're doing a TED Talks about 10 different things you want to talk about and you're given an hour, sure, that's totally fine. But the reality is that the reason why you should avoid information overload is just because of the audience's attention span. You don't want to overwhelm us with information. Because think about it. If you were teaching a subject, would you teach the entire textbook in a day? Or would you spread out that textbook in the span of 16 weeks? And your goal is for your students to obviously grasp and understand the material. Of course, you would spread out the information from a textbook in 16 weeks, because no one can thoroughly, truly understand everything in that textbook in one day, unless they had prior knowledge about that particular textbook, right? They're pretty familiar with those concepts already. But the reality is, it takes time. It takes time to understand material. It takes time to learn a new skill, to really develop and harness information. And the same thing about y'all, right? Whoever's listening to these podcasts and these lessons, there's a reason why some of y'all just constantly rewatch the same video, right? Or rewatch the same lesson, because you really want to just dive deeper into a particular topic and you want to become a master of that. You're not one of those people who just listens over and over and over and over to like multiple related recommended videos. You're out seeking information. You want the answer. Once you get the answer, you apply said information. Now, when it comes to your presentation, again, just avoid information overload because you don't want to overwhelm the audience with information. Focus on what's important. Say what you got to say. Make sure the audience understands what you're saying. And then whatever you don't cover, you can send a PDF, you can send a template, you can send a Word doc, or you can just postpone that information for next week if it's not urgent. There are so many different channels to communicate your message. It doesn't all need to be crammed into an hour-long session, right? There are a lot of things. There are deliverables. There's just so much. There's just so much. But one thing you want to avoid in your presentation is doing too much. Okay? Okay. With that being said, again, these were the 3 bad speaking habits you should avoid for presentations. And then again, these rules they depend on the speaking situation and your audience. So hopefully you can apply them appropriately depending on the situation you're in. Again, a quick little review of these 3 tips is number 1. Avoid sounding pessimistic, apathetic, like you just don't want to be there. Again, you don't want to bring everyone's mood down. It's exhausting. So, at the very least, again, just be professional. I'm not telling you to be energetic and lively and tell a bunch of jokes. I'm not telling you to do that. What I'm saying is just be professional. Keep your emotions in check and just deliver the information. Focus on the goal. Number 2, avoid relying on audience participation. Why? Because you are handing power of your presentation over to your audience. And if you don't know how to maneuver around that, if things go south, then you are in a very, very bad situation. And as a result, your confidence can be crushed because of that. So be wary of audience participation. Again, it depends on your audience. If they're strangers, they're less likely to participate. So pick and choose the situations, pick and choose. And last but not least, information overload, because it just gets to the point where it's like, yo, this is just too much. I can't understand it. And if you are just sharing 15 different tips, it's not about the audience anymore. It's about you trying to just get everything out there because you just want to say, oh, I did everything. I can move on now. But again, it defeats the purpose. The purpose of your presentation was like, okay, we need to talk about this topic and we need to make sure the audience understands that topic or this topic, right? Now, if you're just saying everything you want to say, now you're just being selfish. It's not about the audience anymore. And speeches are always about the audience. So be mindful of that. Okay, this concludes our lesson. Hopefully you have found it useful. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. If you want a copy of my public speaking book, I made it super easy, super concise. You can just flip through it just to look for tips. Hit me up. Okay, until next time, everyone. Take care. This concludes our lesson for today. I hope you found it useful. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me at prof.brianhy@gmail.com. I'll see you next time. Have a wonderful day.